medal, now known as the Military General Service Medal for service between 1793 and 1814, was the first in a series of 3 medals issued in the mid-1800s for retrospective service of British troops in the Napoleonic Wars, in some cases more than 50 years previously. Ironically, the political fight to get the medal awarded at all went on for longer than the actual war. As we saw in episode 1 of this series, the wars we now know as the Napoleonic era finished with the victory by the Allies on the field of Waterloo, and the subsequent awarding of the Waterloo Medal was widely welcomed, especially by the recipients. However, the Battle of Waterloo was, in fact, only the end of a campaign that had been playing out for the previous 20-odd years. There were hundreds of thousands of servicemen, both Army and Navy, who had played an equal, if not much greater part in the downfall of Napoleon than many of the Waterloo medal winners. These men, quite justifiably, were asking where their military award was. While a considerable amount of men on the Waterloo battlefield were veterans of the long, hard slog through Portugal and Spain, circumstances meant that for a lot of the Waterloo medal winners it was their first and only battle. On the other hand, thousands of old warriors had suffered through the long, hard fighting of the campaign for anything up to 7 years away from home, coping with exhaustion, freezing winters, baking summers, and often near starvation, not to mention the very real chance of horrific wounds from the many skirmishes, sieges, and battles that it took to get to Waterloo. If for any reason they were not at Waterloo, for instance discharged as wounded, not able to get there in time, or even posted overseas, they received nothing. The campaign to award a medal for these men began almost immediately, but the voices raised in support were few and far between, and mainly from the rank and file, to whom few were listening. The movement grew steadily, but although there were constant conversations by claimants in various military magazines and mainstream press, the campaign was uncoordinated and unsuccessful. In 1840, a petition was presented to the Duke of Wellington, then a leading light in the House of Lords, on behalf of undecorated officers, pleading for some form of recognition for their wartime service. But the Duke, often pictured wearing a chest full of medals for the same period, declined to help, stating later that he felt it was not his place to recommend such an award, and that any such recommendation should only come from the sovereign. He suggested to the delegation that they should present their pleas to the new Queen Victoria. However, they declined to do so without the Duke's support. In 1842, the government of India announced that it was to present a medal to its troops that had fought in the recent war in China, covered in episode 2 of this series. And the Queen, on hearing of this, directed, more likely on the urging of Prince Albert, that the suggested medal was to be awarded by the Home Government in London. The Duke of Wellington, by now the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, was directed to make the arrangements. This announcement spurred on those wanting a medal for the earlier war, and in 1844 the matter was debated after a motion by Sir Andrew Leith Hay, a Peninsular veteran, in the House of Commons, and although headway was gained, the motion was withdrawn due to the matter having no prospect of succeeding. A year later, in July 1845, the matter went to the House of Lords, but this time the cause had some much bigger guns. The Duke of Richmond, also a Peninsular veteran as aide-de-camp to Wellington, presented the same petition that had been debated in the House of Commons. The Duke of Wellington once again cited his opposition on the grounds the award was the prerogative of the Crown, not the Parliament. He also warned against setting a precedent of awarding medals for long past battles, and again the matter went no further, but Richmond was to prove tireless in his advocacy. Yet another attempt was made back in the House of Commons in 1846, this time moved by Sir de Lacy Evans, another veteran, and again was withdrawn as doomed to fail after opposition from the Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, on the basis that it was now too late to make such a recommendation. De Lacy Evans planned to reintroduce the bill in the next session, but events overtook him when a much higher authority stepped in. In the spring of 1846, the Duke of Richmond sent a copy of the bill put before Parliament to Queen Victoria, who had so far not involved the Crown in the matter. But with increasing support and careful analysis, the Queen, at a stroke, wiped away all opposition and directed that her veteran servicemen receive a medal for their former service. Once again, the Duke of Wellington was directed to make the arrangements, and he soon produced a plan. Medals would be awarded to all those who had been present at any one of the actions for which the Army Gold Medals awarded to high-ranking officers had been produced many years earlier. When presented, the Queen approved the plan and further directed that the medal be made of silver and presented to all who served regardless of rank. She also wanted it to be known as the Peninsular Medal. The day finally came on 1st of June 1847, when the London Gazette published notice of the issuing of the medal and inviting all those who were entitled to receive it to apply. The medal was only awarded to surviving claimants. A combination of factors, including general illiteracy and limited publicity for the new medal, meant that many did not apply for it, with only about 10% of those who served receiving the medal. While next of kin could not apply for a medal on behalf of a deceased relative, they did receive the medal in cases where the claimant had died between their application and the issuing of the actual award. In total, approximately 25,000 were eventually awarded. The medal, like many of its kind for the Victorian era, was minted by the Royal Mint. Designed by William Wyon, it is made of fine silver, 36 millimeters in diameter, and suspended from its ribbon by a no-nonsense straight swiveling suspender. The ribbon is 32 millimeters wide, is of the same colors and design as the one used on both the Army Gold Cross and the Waterloo, crimson with dark blue edges. The obverse, or front, of the medal has the same design as used on both the China War and Sutlej medals issued a few years previously. It features a left-facing effigy of Queen Victoria with the inscription Victoria Regina and the date 1848. The reverse, somewhat ironically given his opposition to the award, depicts a kneeling Duke of Wellington being crowned with a laurel wreath by Queen Victoria, who is standing on a plinth within which lies a dormant lion. Above is the inscription "To the British Army," with the dates 1793 to 1814 below. The name and regiment of the recipient is impressed on the rim in block Roman capitals. Wellington's original proposal to mimic the clasps on the Army Gold Cross was expanded on with the addition of 2 more, the campaigns of Maida and Egypt, bringing the total to 29. And in a quirk of history, although the medal bears the dates 1793 to 1814, the earliest battle commemorated by the medal, that of Egypt, is in fact 1801. The clasps were made of silver by London silversmith and jewellers Hunt and Roskell. They are somewhat smaller and somewhat plainer than those first issued to the army with the Sutlej medal. They are grouped together on carriages either singly, in pairs, or on a triple carriage, the appropriate faceplates bearing the battle names soldered onto the front of the carriage. The carriages were then joined together using lugs and a small rivet. The number of clasps a medal bore determined how the carriages were used. For instance, a medal with 4 clasps would use a triple carriage with a single joined to it. A medal due to have 9 clasps would use 3 triples joined together. The chain of carriages were then attached to the suspender with a straight metal bar passing through the bottom lugs of the carriage and the top hoops of the suspender. The medal ribbon passed down behind the faceplates, around the metal bar, and returned up through the carriage. While the 29 clasps only covered battles fought during the Napoleonic Wars and was known as the Peninsular Medal, 3 of the clasps are to mark the unfortunate and rather unnecessary war of 1812 between the fledgling United States and Great Britain, and 5 of the clasps are for battles fought in Italy, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Java in the Dutch East Indies. It's also worth noting that although great prominence is given to Wellington on the reverse of the medal, he was present at less than half of the engagements. The most clasps awarded to any one recipient was 15. 2 such medals were awarded, one to Private James Talbot of the 45th Foot, and the other Private Daniel Lustad, who fought with the 60th Foot and the King's German Legion. Both men fought throughout the Peninsular Campaign from start to finish. It is beyond the scope of this short video to detail all the battles listed on the clasp, but as a sample of the service required in order to earn the Military Service Medal, we will look at 3 of them. Firstly, Corunna, Britain's first Dunkirk. The British Army, under the command of Sir John Moore, were in Spain fighting alongside the Spanish army against Napoleon, fresh from his victories in Austerlitz, Jena and Eylau. Vastly outnumbered, the Spanish were soon defeated, leaving Moore with little alternative but to withdraw to the coast in order to hope for evacuation by the Royal Navy. The retreat of the British, closely followed by their French pursuers, took them through mountainous terrain in dreadful conditions of cold and snow, and was marked by exhausting marches, privation and suffering. A distance of over 300 miles was covered, with many of the troops having no footwear. They were accompanied by hundreds of women and children, some of whom had to be abandoned along with the sick and wounded to the mercy of the French. Discipline broke down, and Moore ordered hangings as punishment to restore order. One such execution had to be abandoned when the French launched a surprise attack. The condemned were released on condition that they fought well in aiding the defence. Fortunately, the rearguard under Major General Edward Paget held fast and maintained discipline, enabling the army to reach the coast of Corunna in northwest Spain, only to find that there were no ships. The transports had been delayed and would not arrive for another 3 days. With the French closing in, Moore had no choice. He deployed his fighting troops in a defensive ring around the port and awaited the inevitable attack, but in a move that was echoed 131 years later, the enemy paused, giving him and the exhausted troops time to recover. When the ships finally arrived, loading commenced with the sick, wounded, and non-essentials first. 2 days later, on the 16th of January 1809, the French arrived. Moore accelerated the embarkation as his fighting troops stood their ground and even forced the French back. And Moore was contemplating a victory when he was struck on the shoulder by a cannonball that tore off his left arm. Mortally wounded, he was carried from the field and died in a house by the harbour. The evacuation continued all the next day without much interference from the French, and when the remnants of the army, about 19,000, reached England, there was a public outcry at their condition and the ordeal they had endured. The British lost about 800 men in the final battle outside Corunna, along with countless men, women and children left behind during the retreat to die in the freezing mountains. For the second class, we will take a brief look at what takes place a little over 3 years later. The British, under the command of Wellington, had returned to Spain via Portugal and had been advancing and retreating across both countries, attempting to get the better of the French, whilst at the same time not coming under concentrated attack by the more numerous enemy. By January 1812, Wellington was ready to advance into Spain for good. Having already captured the fortress of Ciudad Rodrigo, for which another of the medal class was awarded, it was vital that he took the fortress at Badajoz. This was the 3rd time the fortress had come under siege, the other 2 unsuccessful, but this time Wellington was stronger and better equipped. The siege began in March. The British had about 27,000 men, 52 guns, and a capable siege train, but they faced a formidable challenge. The French had 5,000 men, but they had strengthened the defences, mined the walls, and flooded the eastern approaches. The assault on the fort began on the southeastern section. 3 breaches were battered in the wall, and finally, on the 6th of April 1812, Wellington gave the order to attack. From the start, things went badly wrong. a late start and mismatched timings led to confusion, and some of the columns got lost. The defenders fought doggedly, and the attackers faced mines, barrels of gunpowder, planks of nails, and barricades of sword blades. The French held down grenades, bales of burning hay, and even stones. The Forlorn Hope, the name given to the first men into the attack, were massacred. An hour passed with no progress except that over 2,000 British soldiers lay dead at the foot of the wall. Just as Wellington was about to call off the attack, Lieutenant General Thomas Picton's 3rd Division, along with units of the 5th Division, led by Major Lord Fitzroy Somerset, managed to make it to the top of the wall. The thinly stretched defenders gave way, and the town was doomed as the British poured into the gaps. The French fell back to the neighbouring outwork of San Cristobal and surrendered shortly after the town had fallen. The next day, Wellington was seen to be weeping as he surveyed the carnage. Bodies were piled high, and blood flowed like rivers in the ditches and trenches. The army suffered 4,800 casualties, but the siege was over, and Wellington had secured the Portuguese-Spanish frontier. He could now advance into Spain. 2 years later, the 3rd clasp is for a battle that should not have been fought, that of Toulouse. Napoleon, fighting with his army in Germany, was facing overwhelming odds and being beaten back into France by a combined Prussian-Russian army, the Allies entering Paris on 30th of March 1814 after a short battle, and Napoleon surrendering on 6th of April 1814, and the war officially ended. Wellington, having fought his way across Spain and over the Pyrenees, pursued Marshal Soult, who he had recently bested at the Battle of Orthez, to the French city of Toulouse. The city was well defended, and Soult had 42,000 men and plenty of artillery. The geography of the city was also going to make it tough for the attackers. On the 10th of April 1814, 4 days after the surrender of Napoleon but before the news reached Wellington, the attack began. The British attacked the city from 3 different directions under 5 different commanders. It was a complicated strategy and soon went wrong. 2 Spanish divisions under General Ferrer attacked early and met the full strength of the French defenders and were beaten back with heavy casualties. General Beresford, meanwhile, attacking from the east, pushed forward but was met with heavy resistance. After nearly 9 hours of fighting, there was a pause, after which Picton, attacking from the north, renewed the attack with the support of the surviving Spaniards, but that too made little progress. It did, however, take the pressure off Beresford, who at last broke through. The French retreated behind the city walls, but with the Allied army advancing, withdrew the next day. On the morning of the 12th of April, a delegation of city officials handed over the city to the Allied army. That afternoon, Wellington got news via Bordeaux of Napoleon's surrender and abdication. British casualties totaled 4,500, and the French lost 3,200, none of which needed to have happened had the news been able to reach the area sooner. The process of manufacture and distribution took several years to complete, but eventually they were ready to go and sent worldwide to eager recipients. By far, the majority went to British personnel, but there were units in the West Indies, Malta, India, Germany, and even France. An interesting side note to the overseas recipients is of those sent to Canada. There were about 550 medals sent to European soldiers that fought with the Newfoundland and Canadian units in the war with America, but also 102 medals were awarded to native Canadian Indians for their service with the Army. Their medals, as with all others, were impressed with their name, but did not have any rank or regiment. Instead, they had the simple and proud title of warrior. Surely the most apt title for all the men who ever received a medal for service in the field. The medal we have in our collection was awarded to John Stenson of the 20th Foot. During the Napoleonic Wars, the 20th Foot served in several early campaigns before serving with distinction in the Peninsular War. Their performance was particularly noted at the Battle of Vittoria, where they formed part of the backbone of Wellington's forces. They wore the standard uniform of the day with white trousers and the famous red jacket with yellow facings. They were equipped with the Brown Bess musket. John Stenson was born in Derby in 1787 and enlisted in the regiment in 1809. He spent the first years of his service life in barracks at Colchester and stationed in Ireland. Then he and his regiment arrived in Lisbon in November 1812, joining up with the rest of the army in Spain in January 1813. Stenson fought in the battles of Vittoria, Pyrenees, Nieve, and Orthez. At Orthez, he received a gunshot wound to the left arm and was hospitalized for the rest of the war. He was discharged from the army on the 10th of January 1815, at that time being described as 29 years old, 5 foot 6 inches tall, brown hair, hazel eyes, and fair complexion. By trade, a labourer. He returned to Derby to become a bricklayer and plasterer, married his wife Mary, and had at least 4 children. He died, still in Derby, in 1864. Join us next time when we take a look at the second of the trio of retrospective Napoleonic War medals, this time for the Navy.